Slightly wonky, but it's fine. Right. Good morning and welcome to this month's skills refresher. Today's subject is the boring and slightly stinky subject of reclaim. Right, so it's not that sexy, it's not that exciting, but the way you got to look at it is free clay. Obviously, reclaim is the pottery word for recycling, so there's that. And let's start with reclaiming your pieces when you're hand building. So if you were at the slabbing workshop last month, then you will remember my piece of advice with not letting it break down completely. So if you've got a nice medium wet bit of clay and you think, oh, I could reclaim this, I'm going to suggest don't bother. If it's a piece of clay that hasn't been broken down, so it hasn't been through on the wheel, or it hasn't been, some of those small particles haven't been separated out from the big particles, you're better off just letting it rehydrate. So dipping your piece of clay into a plastic bag, letting it have a sit for 24 to 48 hours, giving it a really good wedge. That is much more preferable than this process, which is longer and more dull. You can use that for handles that have been rolled out if you're going to be attaching them. You can use that for the lugs you're attaching your pieces of clay to the wheel with, even if they've got a few of the bits stuck to it. Doesn't matter. Let it have a really good rehydrate and a really good wedge, and it'll be fine to use again. So reclaiming your pieces that have been thrown or things that have gone completely bone dry. Obviously, even it's the same with a hand built piece. If you've got a piece that's gone completely dry and you look at it and you think, nah, or it's got a crack or the handle's fallen off or whatever, and you want to be able to use it again, you're going to need to break it down. So the process of breaking down your pieces that have previously bone dry is called slaking. And that just means that your pieces are going to melt down. So the idea you would use preferably warm water. It's going to be an easier process. It's just going to break it down a bit quicker. And quite often people put a bit of vinegar in there as well. So we all know from the magic water, vinegar is going to help break down your clay. And it's also theoretically going to make it a little bit less stinky. It's still got bacteria in it, but some of the bad bacteria actually stops from developing. So a lot of people put vinegar in as a bit of a clay conditioner. If you're breaking down a piece of clay or you've got trimmings and curls that are dry from when you were trimming your pots, you want to have your water in there first and just pour your bits of broken pot and clay in there. You don't want it to be completely overfilled. You want, as the pieces of clay are sort of dropping into that water, they're going to start absorbing it and they're going to settle and they're going to break down. They're going to look a little bit like this. So you can see in this bucket how all those particles are loose and they break up, and that's what you want to happen. You don't want it to be too thick. You want to have lots of space in between it. Let it sit and let that water soak through without touching it for, I normally say, overnight. People say you can do it for a few hours, but overnight everything's going to have gone through and be really broken through. The next thing you're going to do is blend it. However, you're not going to blend it straight like that, because otherwise your reclaim's going to be really wet. So you want to take off all of that water that's settled on the top before you start to mix it. So you can either tip it off, but you also want all those fine particles that are going to settle on the top. You want them to sit there. So the best way to do it is to actually just use a sponge. Actually, I can give you a demo of that. Let me get myself a sponge and tell you what that looks like. Using a sponge is just quite a nice controlled way of doing it. You can just tip it off, but then you're going to lose all those fine particles. So why do you need those fine particles for the clay? If you're recycling your clay and it has been previously thrown, say it's the trimmings from a thrown pot or it's a thrown pot that you're slaking down, loads and loads of those fine particles end up in your throwing water. So if you're a thrower, I would suggest keeping your throwing water. Obviously, we always say to everyone when we're recycling stuff, and look, you can see how it's mostly clear, and then I'd maybe take a little bit more off, and from there I'm going to mix it. So keep your throwing water. This is obviously something that I'm going to encourage people to bring their own pots to do, because otherwise we end up with every single bowl from under the sink on everyone's shelves. But a good habit to get into is, when you're throwing, you keep your jug or your bowl or whatever, and you've got your throwing water, you're going to get all your slops, chuck it in there, sit that to one side, and then when you're trimming, those trimmings go straight back in. So that wet clay has not only got all the kind of big particles that made its way into the pot, but all the fine particles, and then that's what you're going to blend. So from here, obviously we have great big buckets of reclaim in the studio. You give it a really good mix. Let's just get a good mix. Oh, the good stuff. The more you mix it, the more smooth and homogeneous it's going to be. If you're mixing up one type of clay, it's going to be way easier. Obviously in the studio, in our reclaim, we have lots of different types of clays, and that's why we sometimes get a bit of that, I call it like the bologna effect. When you slice into the reclaim and you can see a bit of brown, a bit of white, a bit of whatever. But the more you mix it, the less you have to wedge it to get it even if it is mixed clay. So that's method number one, which is good for working as a person on your own and you're working with smaller amounts of clay. If you're going to be mixing up lots of different bits of clay, I would suggest keeping your pieces in a wet bucket, only because it's going to produce less dust. So we always have our reclaim bucket obviously at the end of where the wheels are, and we have another one by the sink, and that is, you chuck your water into it, chuck any pots into it, it all sits there and becomes that George's Marvellous Medicine soup of clay. It just, again, it means that we're just producing less dust, and as we all know, clay dust isn't bad for your lungs. So we get those big old tubs and use, I think it's either a paint mixer or a cement mixer. So you can get little drill attachments, paddles, to do smaller amounts. We've got the great big one. If you do end up with a great big bucket of clay that needs to be reclaimed, you're more than welcome to use it. Otherwise, I suggest using a smaller one. Or say, you can see by hand, that wouldn't take too much more.
Is that hand mixer?
You can use a hand mixer. I used to sometimes use literally things you make meringues with, exactly. So you want it to be, the texture I would describe it as is this sort of pudding, right? You want to really get it quite nice and smooth. Once it's at that texture, we use plaster bats to dry out our reclaim. There are lots of different ways of drying your reclaim. Some people pour them into pillowcases and hang them up and all sorts of different things. I didn't have very much success with that. Some people love it. I think it depends on your climate, obviously. But I remember having a pillowcase I could barely get hung up because it was so heavy. So I was struggling with this big bag of wet clay. The outside dried and then the inside turned up to be liquid, and it was just a whole mess. So I would definitely recommend making a plaster bat. We have them available in the studio. If it's something you're going to be doing a lot, I would suggest getting your own one, because it might just mean that you've always got one available, right? Once we've got to the point we've got that pudding, it sits onto the plaster bat and we leave it. How long we leave it is a question people always ask, and it's the same thing that we normally say, which is how long is a piece of string? How thick was the actual mix in the first place? How dry was the plaster bat when you put it on? Because they get used quite intensely, and you'll feel if it feels a bit heavy and a bit cold, it's been previously used and it might take longer to draw that moisture out of your pot. Again, ambient temperature. This kind of weather, we can get them done probably overnight. In the winter, it can take 2 weeks. We're all sort of sitting there coming back and checking the clay. It's really good actually today, because I've got a piece of clay that would be prepared and is the right thickness, the right moisture level for wedging. So you want to put it on about 2 to 3 inches thick, give or take. If you've got a really big piece of plaster, you can go probably up to 5 inches, but having it a couple of inches means it's more likely to be able to be controlled as it's drying. It can obviously get too dry, so you're better off taking it off before it's too dry, and then letting your reclaim to be a little bit wetter, so actually it's going to sit and it's going to continue to replasticize and break down in the bag, and when you come to use it, just give a little wedge on some plaster so it's the right consistency. Because if you get it at the perfect consistency now, you might not touch it for 3 months, and then in that time, even inside the bag, it'll start to dry out a little bit. Another really good piece of advice that I can give you is date your reclaim. So I've got bags of reclaim from 3 or 4 years ago, and I only know that because it sort of says speckled 21 or whatever. The longer you leave your reclaim, it matures, it gets really nice, really plastic. So just going back to what the difference between plastic and short clay is. Obviously, when you only have the big particles in your clay and you've washed them all away and you've chucked all your thrown water away because you didn't know, and you try and reclaim it and you go to use it, when you roll a piece of clay and it's not plastic, as you bend it, it's going to have little cracks on it, like short crust pastry. So you want to check the plasticity of your clay. Same if we're going to be gathering up wild clay. You roll it and you twist it, and if you've got a nice smooth bend, like a bit of plasticine, that's good. That's golden, that's what you want. Right, so for throwing or for anything, having plastic clay means you're less likely for it to be brittle. So this is the right kind of moisture level. So come and have a feel. We've obviously got it on a relatively thick board. There's not tons of clay there. You see how easily it comes off. It's not super dry, so give it a squish. You might think, oh, it's still a little bit wet, but actually it's never going to be even, because if I flip it over, that's it. Look how firm that is. So you really want to get a nice mix. So I would just roll it up and start to give it a wedge. Wedging on the plaster, but you can see how now, actually, do you know what? Might need a bit longer, she says. It's a little bit wet. It's fooled me, but it's nearly there. So the plaster bats, we can make them. Things to think about with plaster: when you're taking them off or using them, you've got to be really careful with them. Any bits of plaster that get scraped into your clay is going to contaminate it. And contaminated clay with a bit of plaster in it will mean your beautiful pieces you've been working on for weeks and weeks are not going to survive, and no one wants that. You want to try and make sure when you're making a plaster bat, you're putting in quite a lot of plaster into the mix, because it makes it stronger. Sometimes it can stop it from being as absorbent, but it's actually more important that it's strong then it's super absorbent. So thinner, weaker plaster, you'll feel chips and stuff. This is actually one of the really old, strong ones. And again, don't use metal on them.
And don't use plaster of Paris.
Use potter's plaster, exactly, which you can get on Scarborough or Bath Potters or any of our lovely suppliers that we use. It dries firmer. Plaster of Paris is super, super soft and will just crumble away, and all your hard efforts will be for nothing. And don't use metal. Metal will scrape it off and it'll end up inside your pots. Other things to think about when you're using your plaster is when you want to get it clean, don't run it under water. It'll take 2 weeks to dry out. So you want to use a nice damp sponge, get off the most of it, and then you're kind of in a good place to do it. So give it a really good wedge. When you get to that point, date it, and then I suggest leaving it alone for a bit. You can buy clay conditioners. We have some. They probably do help break it down a little bit, but time will also do the same thing. It will just help everything start. That bacteria that broke it down in the first place will get to work, and it should give you some really nice plastic clay. I love working with Reclaim. It's really smooth, it's really plastic, and it does feel like free clay. There's lots of places it is kind of quite labour intensive. So like I said, if you can get to the point where you're reclaiming before the whole kind of breakdown piece, if you can go, this could actually have a bit of a dunk and be left alone, then that will save you a bit of work. All right, so any questions?
How many times can you, doesn't matter, does it?
Indefinitely. Yeah, indefinitely. Yes.
Yeah.
So things you can actually mix, as long as your clays have similar firing temperatures, you can mix them. I do. Lots of other potters will be like, no, but if you think about clay, you take it out of the ground, it's got 10 different types of stone that have been made into it.
Yeah.
You might find also the Reclaim's going to shrink more than other clays. I found that. And that's because I think that you have the big particles and it just comes together. Obviously, don't ever mix earthenware clay with stoneware clay, but we don't have earthenware clay in the studio to avoid that ever happening. Yes, any other questions?
But have you got a different percentage?
It'll work itself out somewhere in the middle, but you may find that I would always test it. So if you're doing a little, like I did my kind of mixed up bag of whatever clay, I had to test that it fit with all my glazes because I wasn't sure what the shrinkage would be. So we tend to have quite forgiving glazes in the studio, but if you find one that's really not fitting with any of your glazes, you can always then mix that reclaimed clay with another standard clay and just wedge it together, and that should give you a bit more of a sturdy, stable clay.
How long would you, when you say you can leave it and rest it, what's the minimum time?
You can throw with clay that's been recycled pretty much straight away. I tend to try and leave it for about a month. And I'm not sure what the exact science it is. I think it just settles a little bit, and it tends to and that bacteria that's in it starts to bring it all together a little bit. You'll feel clay that's kind of freshly reclaimed because it feels quite loose, if that makes sense. And obviously if you're working with a grogged clay, that's going to dry out much quicker on the back because it's got that open body versus something that's got more of a closed small particle.
Does some clay go mouldy?
That's just bacteria.
Yeah.
And actually, I love it when it goes mouldy because that means it's getting really plastic. So if you think about what clay is, decomposed rock, right? And the things that have decomposed it is bacteria. I don't know the exacts in the bacteria. I need to get into my pottery encyclopedia. But so that bacteria is never a bad thing. It can make it stinky. And I've literally had white clay that's gone black and all gone grey, and that's from the bacteria. But it's really smooth, it's really plastic, and actually when it fires white again, it all burns off. This has been quite a quick one, guys. Any other questions?
No, excellent.
So things to think about for you is if you're going to be doing lots of reclaim, you maybe need to get your own bowl or your own jug to use. When you're throwing on the wheel, keep all your scoop up your throwing water, and you can literally let it settle, use a sponge, chuck it off, and then use that straight away, put your trimming straight into that, and that's what you're going to be blending together. That makes things really easy and straightforward. We want to keep a specific clay, so if I'm working with a porcelain, it's not going in my whatever bucket. That's what I do. And we have plaster bats to use in the studio, but if again it's something that you're going to be doing a lot of, if you're a thrower and you find you have loads and loads of reclaim, it might be worth making your own one. But that's something again that we can have a look at doing a workshop on. The only thing with plaster is you have to wear a mask when you're working with it because it gets really dusty and it's really easy to contaminate stuff.
So you can do it outside.
We'll do it somewhere else, basically. In bigger studios, they have plaster areas because obviously you have slip casters and all that kind of stuff. So, yes. Any other questions, guys? There we go. Golden. You're very welcome. I've got lots of nice clay on my hands. I'll press. Oh.